So, what does it really mean to be smart? Is it just about getting a high score on a test, or is it something, I don't know, bigger than that, like a whole collection of different talents that each of us has? Let's get into it because today we're going to unpack one of the most fascinating and maybe most overlooked types of intelligence out there.
For the longest time, the main idea of intelligence was pretty simple. It was one single thing, right? Often called IQ, something you could measure and then plot on a bell curve. But what if that's not the whole picture? In the 1980s, a psychologist named Howard Gardner came along and basically said, hold on a second. He proposed that we don't just have one intelligence, we have many. It's not about a single score, but a whole spectrum of different talents.
And that's exactly what brings us to our focus for today. We're going to zoom way in on one of these talents. It's an ability that your typical test doesn't really look for, but it is incredibly powerful. We're talking about the ability to think in 3D.
It's officially known as spatial visualization, or you can just call it spatial intelligence. So what is it? Well, at its core, it's being able to look at a flat, 2D image, like say a blueprint or a map, and then in your mind, build a complete 3D model of it. You can spin it around, flip it over, check it out from every single angle, all without actually touching anything.
Now, what's really interesting here is that this isn't seen as just a learned skill, like learning to ride a bike. It's thought to be an innate aptitude. It's just how your brain is naturally wired. And people who have a real knack for this, they're often called 3D visualizers.
So, does any of this sound familiar? You might be a 3D visualizer if you're the person who can just glance at those flat-pack furniture instructions and immediately see the finished product. Or maybe you're someone who always draws a quick diagram to understand a new idea. These are often the folks who rock classes like physics or architecture, who are absolute wizards at packing a car trunk perfectly, or who just love building massive, complex worlds in video games.
And this brings up a really key point, especially if you've ever taken an aptitude test. It's important to remember the difference between the aptitude itself and the test. The aptitude is that deep, core ability to think in 3D. The test, with all its little paper folding puzzles or rotating shapes, that's just an exercise. It's a tool they use to try and measure how strong that core ability is. The puzzle isn't the skill, it's just trying to kick the tires on your mental 3D engine.
Okay, so this is a cool talent to have, for sure. But how does it actually play out in the real world? Well, it turns out that being a 3D visualizer isn't just a neat party trick. It can open the door to some really incredible and important jobs. I mean, think about it. Architects and engineers literally see entire buildings and bridges in their minds long before a single brick is laid. Art directors and interior designers, they shape the world we see around us. And it's even vital for careers you might not expect, like crime scene investigators who have to mentally reconstruct a whole sequence of events based on the physical clues left behind. This ability is a serious tool, whether you're in science, art, or even public service.
And if you want the perfect, most classic example of this in action, Michelangelo. Before he ever touched a chisel to that giant block of marble, he could already see the statue of David trapped inside. He was mentally rotating it, chipping away the pieces in his mind's eye. Now that is the power of a 3D visualizer.
All right, so let's zoom back out for a second. We've been talking a lot about this one type of intelligence, but where did the whole idea even come from? Let's put it back in its original context. Right, so remember Howard Gardner, the guy we mentioned at the start? Well, this concept of spatial intelligence was a huge part of his big idea. He laid it all out in a book he published back in 1983 called Frames of Mind, and it completely challenged the old-school idea that everyone thinks and learns the same way. And here's the whole shebang. Gardner originally came up with 7 and then added an 8th. And as you can see, spatial intelligence, what he sometimes called picture smart, is just one slice of the pie. It sits alongside things like being word smart or music smart. His whole point was that we all have our own unique blend, our own special profile of these different intelligences.
Okay, but, and this is a pretty big but, this is where the story gets a lot more complicated. Gardner's theory became wildly popular, especially in the world of education. But how it was received by the scientific community, well, that's a whole different story.
So you've basically got these two camps. On one side, you have educators who absolutely loved this theory. And why wouldn't they? It got them away from labeling kids with a single score, it promoted a more inclusive classroom, and it was great for student self-esteem. But on the other side, you have a lot of scientists, a lot of cognitive psychologists who push back hard. They said, for all its feel-good appeal, the theory just doesn't have the hard scientific evidence to back it up.
And their criticisms were pretty pointed. They argued that the definitions for each intelligence are kind of vague and hard to test scientifically. They'd point out that there really aren't any published studies that prove these 8 intelligences are actually separate things. In fact, a lot of the evidence suggests they're all pretty interconnected. And finally, they'd ask, are we really talking about intelligences here, or are these just skills and talents with a different name?
To give you an idea of how strong the pushback was, one researcher, Lynn Waterhouse, reviewed all the literature out there and came to a really blunt conclusion. She said the theory simply has no validating data. And to be fair, Gardner himself has admitted that his theory hasn't really gone through the kind of rigorous experimental testing that its critics have been calling for.
So all of this leaves us with a really fascinating question to chew on. Does a theory need to be proven in a lab with hard data for it to have value? Or can an idea, even one without that scientific stamp of approval, be incredibly valuable just because of its power to totally change how we think about learning, about human potential, and about what it really truly means to be smart? It's definitely something to think about.